Is Watergate the greatest coup against an elected American president to replace him with someone totally unelected for vice president or president in Gerald Ford? All that and more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to combat cancel culture by placing them on the right podcasts and new media. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. Reminder before we jump into this conversation to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. And guys, I'm excited for this conversation today. He's beaming in directly from Texas as we have Tony Arburn back with us on the show. Tony, thanks for hanging out with me today, man.
It's good to see you again, and thanks for having me back on the show. I'd like to say, just free plug. I'll follow up on that on the Command Your. I'm also a client and a happy one, so give it a look if you're interested.
And this is by no means a promotion. You're just one of the smartest people I know on a lot of these subjects. I've been bringing in to talk about them, but the one I wanted to dig into today is Watergate, which we're going to get into in a second. But just before we do that, tell us a little about who you are, what you do, man. For people that may not know who you are and what you do.
Well, I am the founder and CEO of Wise Wolf Gold and Silver Exchange, which is my primary business, but I'm also a broadcaster. I have a radio show called the Arburn Radio Transmission, ART, and I'm a combat veteran. I have a background in military service, business, and I'm a paratrooper who likes books. So a lot of my wheelhouse is philosophy, history, and these little cul-de-sacs of our timeline. And this one that we're talking about, you and I have talked off air. I'm a huge fan of, actually my favorite movie is Oliver Stone's Nixon. I would say, and I've said it on my show, I think I've seen it more than the director Oliver Stone. I would go head to head. I know that's his favorite film, by the way, the one he made. If you go back and look at it's a masterpiece, and it's really highly underrated. And it's a tour de force, and it's very loud and like imagery, and everything he cut on that was just really unique. Because if you watch JFK, it's with Kevin Costner, and it's conspiratorial, and there's some deep dives, and it's the beautiful haunting music and stuff. But Nixon it's a follow up to that, and it's just so different. And I think he got in a lot of trouble from Hollywood and the elite. Because if you watch the movie, spoiler alert, it came out in 95, folks, so spoiler if you haven't watched it. But if you get to the end of the movie, it takes you to Nixon's final day in office, August 9th, 1974, and he gives this really beautiful, off-the-cuff speech. He didn't have notes or anything. He'd been up most of the night, and he was leaving office, about to turn over power to Gerald Ford. And he said some really beautiful words about character. And it's really, again, the mainstream narrative and what court historians are supposed to paint about Nixon, Oliver Stone departed and just had Anthony Hopkins play him. And that, I think the end of the movie really shocked people, because it wasn't like throwing him in the trash or the ash heap of history. It was more like, let this man speak. And that's how he ended his, can you imagine like a crushing defeat of having to resign the presidency, the only president in history that ever did that. He wasn't impeached. And there, again, we'll get into that. But there was I think a moment of him showing his humanity and like what he'd overcome, and talked about his parents. And I actually have a part of the speech tattooed on my arm. I got back years ago on the anniversary. That I'm not politically a huge fan of Nixon. And I've written about this because my grandfather turned me on to Nixon when I got out of the military. One of his books is called In the Arena. It was one of the final books that Nixon wrote. It's a really beautiful book, too. So there's a lot of surprising things about Nixon. And I think what we'll get into with Watergate is that it's a complete anomaly in American history. Everything has a gate now to it, the gate. I mean, there's just all the different gates. Everything is associated with a gate. because of the
I think in
Watergate
addition to being
hotel.
a political phenomenon, it's like become a cultural phenomenon as well. You know, like Tom Brady's Deflategate. You know, is he deflating the football so he can throw a better spiral or things like that? It has become a cultural phenomenon as well.
Right. Yeah, it's entered our lexicon, and again, it's not what you think that it is. Watergate is very much a mystery, and I think it was an internal thing between, and again, we'll try to dive into this between Nixon and the deep state itself, who was in charge, and I think that was the real coup, the silent coup that went on in 1971 through 74.
I want to get back to that part in a second because I think that is really important. And I guess, so let's put a bookmark in that for a second. And I guess just coming up to modernly, I think the thing that's interesting, and I feel like the same thing happened last year for the Kennedy assassination. If you see, Tucker picked it up. Grant Cardone was doing something about it. Like, it seemed like for some reason, it was now okay to talk about Kennedy and talk about it in a way that, like, well, we know the CIA did it, but we're all kind of okay with it now because they're kinder and gentler, and they handle us in a different way. And it seems like the same thing has happened this year with Watergate, where I'm seeing, once again, Tucker does a 3-hour long form piece on it. There's a lot of people talking about Watergate. And I feel like for the last 10, 15 years since I've been doing this stuff, like, it really wasn't talked about all that much. Why do you think in the cultural zeitgeist, all of a sudden, people are talking about it and it's just kind of assumed, okay, well, we know who did it, we know why they did it, but it's cool now?
There seems to be, with history, if it's buried, again, the official narratives sometimes bury the truth. It seems that over time, those things give way and the truth eventually enters our vision. Mm-hmm. That seems to be what happens. Just my own study of history. And so I would say that a lot of these things, and some people, because they held on to power, or their underlings and their protégés have also passed on. So that power and that grip begins to loosen. You can find the same thing, I think, right now in our discussion of UFOs and ufology with, they act like the first run-in with, unidentified flying objects or whatever's going on now with the military just happened in 2004 and 17 with the release of the Tic Tac video. I'm like, no. This goes back, at least to the 1940s and really before. And there's a whole culture of, study on the Cold War and the military industrial complex and UFOs. So that stuff's coming out. And I'm thinking, well, we've been studying this for years. What are you guys are late to the party? So I think this is the same thing with Watergate. There's something to it. It's the same reason we probably continue to talk about the Titanic, because there's something wrong with it. Like, if there's something wrong with the history, it just continues to rub you the wrong way. And then somebody comes along, or at least enough scholarship happens, and people go, I'm going to think a second time on this, and it resets what we understand about the past.
So I guess when we're digging into Watergate, where's the best place to start on this? Because there's so many different threads on this. There's, even the smoking gun audio tape itself, which, Nixon might have been talking about something even different than what they go after him for. So I guess when we're kind of looking at setting the stage here, where do you think is the best place to start talking about this?
That's a great question. I think
because I think you could start too far toward the end, right? Or you can start far enough towards the beginning. So it's kind of like, I guess, in your opinion, you've been studying this a lot.
You got to look and see. Okay, so there's this figure, there's Richard Nixon, who comes from nothing. I mean,
he's a Quaker, by the way, too, isn't he?
Quaker roots. His mother Hannah was a Quaker. His father, became a Quaker by just by marrying Hannah. It was a very devout Christian family. Impoverished. His dad, out in Whittier, California, just always trying to make something of himself and failing. They end up having a little roadside gas station and grocery store, not a real grocery, but a market. Yeah. And that's how they paid the bills. He always joked that his dad had the poorest lemon ranch in California. He sold it right before they found oil. They found oil, and he could have been a rich man. He was always avoiding being rich. So you go back, he's very unlikely to ever be anything. But he lost two brothers young. Again, his brother Arthur had some spinal meningitis, and his older brother Harold, he died of tuberculosis, and that was enabled Nixon's family to have enough money to send him to college. And they actually called him like Iron Butt Nixon because he was just study all the time. Like he was no fun, always a very serious guy and introverted. Pat Buchanan, who worked for him later in the 1960s and through the 70s, before Nixon left office, wrote about him later and said he was a lot like the beginning of the snows of Kilimanjaro. Hemingway talks about there was a leopard found at the top of the mountain and in Kilimanjaro, and no one knows how they got there. Nixon was a lot like that leopard. How in the world did he get all the way up there? Because he really was not an outgoing man. He's a very introspective, thoughtful man, very driven, very determined. And it's funny because you'll hear me talk about him and you think I'd agree with him politically. He was a lot of his political ideas were terrible. Some of them were brilliant, but some of them were just god awful. Because I mention him all the time when I talk about going off the gold standard. But I think what you had to go back to is his political career. He starts out in 1946. In California, he runs against a congressman named Jerry Voorhees, who was very popular, very socialist, left-leaning. But Nixon comes out of World War II as a Navy vet and served in the Pacific, and just cleans Jerry Voorhees' clock, man. And nobody thought that Voorhees could be defeated, but Nixon outworks him, outmaneuvers him, confronts, does all this. He's very hard-nosed. And then he gets into Congress and comes across Alger Hiss. And that's when the days of Joe McCarthy and anti-communism, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And Jerry Voorhees was gone, but he has Alger Hiss in his sights, and he's trying to figure out how to, because there's a witness named Whittaker Chambers, who was an ex-communist, who's saying, look, Alger Hiss, who was at Yalta with FDR, very much beloved by the State Department and the establishment itself. Here's this poor guy from, he's nothing, has no backing, no rich family, no ties to the establishment, again, not brought to the party. But Nixon exposes, short story, he believes Whittaker Chambers that Alger Hiss is a communist spy. He keeps continuing to go after Alger Hiss, finally gets him for perjury. And Alger Hiss had been passing secrets on to the Soviet Union during his time working for the State Department. So Nixon overnight becomes very popular in the grassroots and the anti-communists and the right wing because he nails a victory and says, look, there's communists in the State Department. I found one, basically, and this is what Joe McCarthy was saying, which is funny now because Joe McCarthy came out and said, I've got a list, of 150 names in the State Department that are communists. And I always joke on my show, I'm like, I could do that right now. You just hit print of all the people that work there. It's just, there's all the communists are in the State Department. It's pretty much all of them. So it's kind of irrelevant history today, but he gains popularity, runs for Senate, does the same thing with Helen Cahaga Douglas, and he called her pink right down to her underwear. He's a fighter. Eisenhower puts him on the ticket in 1952, and Eisenhower didn't know how old he was. I believe he's was a little bit younger than what J.D. Vance is right now. So I think J.D. Vance is the youngest to be put on the ticket since Nixon. So Eisenhower didn't know that. He fought his way out of the Checkers crisis, which is they accused him of having a slush fund. He goes live on television, delivers this really powerful explanation of all his finances, and has his wife come out and says, this is Pat's Republican cloth coat and all this stuff. I'm doing this all off memory, by the way.
It's pretty
Thanks
impressive, by the way,
this.
all these names you're pulling out and everything. I think people assume you have notes in front of you.
No, I don't. This is just me and this is stuff I think about all the time. Every once in a while, I'll catch myself doing the tune to the Nixon movie in my head, but don't tell anybody. Really, he's a fighter. And that's why if you're somebody who's like the driven person and you kind of identify with that's man against the world kind of thing, and he's a big thinker, and so he takes on a lot of responsibility. He really wanted to serve Eisenhower. He really wanted Eisenhower to love him and to appreciate him and all that. And I think that was just part of his personality. He wanted to serve. His ego was not like what you think it might be. He was a very wounded guy, but driven. One of his coaches when he played football, he's a terrible athlete, and his coach said it's the worst athlete I've ever seen, but he's got guts. Because he just hit so hard, or just get hit hard, and again keep getting back up. So that was his role, was to be Eisenhower's heavy hand. And they put him on this was during what was becoming this conflict of the Cold War. Because people don't realize, we were allies with the Soviet Union in World War II. They didn't get the bomb till I think 1948, 1949. So there was a time where we were the only nuclear power. And of course, those same secrets, the Rosenbergs, they passed them on to the Soviet Union. Our own people gave them the bomb and the technology. So Nixon really comes on at this time in history where there's a lot of tension, a lot of unknown. And they put him on as vice president. He's on the security cabinet, and they start running all these operations. And these operations were to roll back communism, take out leaders. This is where the CIA becomes.
I was going to ask, when you say they, you're talking about the CIA?
I'm talking about the CIA, because really the CIA gets put into our timeline in 1947 with a document. It was NC 68. NSC 68, I believe, is the document. And that's where you get the birth of the NSA, the CIA, the Air Force, and really the birth of the modern security state. So it's not that old. So it comes around that, Nixon's on the security cabinet working, carrying out Eisenhower's bidding, really. A lot of the dark stuff, we're getting rid of leaders, setting up coups, propaganda, anti-communist stuff worldwide, especially in Latin America. So if you fast forward to watching a movie like Oliver Stone's Nixon, if you don't know the cues, then you don't know the language doesn't really catch you. But I've watched it so many times, and there's these little things that he'll throw in. So the movie opens up, and it's Nixon going into his office, and Bob Haldeman, who worked for him, who is his chief of staff, and some of the other John Dean and all these, his lawyer who later turned on him, and all those guys are in there, and Ehrlichman, and they're all talking, and he's about to leave, and they say, "Hey, sir, there's one more thing." And this is supposed to be June of 72. And
is this when him and Bob Haldeman have the conversation about the way the investigation is going?
Well, this is the beginning where they tell him about Watergate, because what they had been doing is,
so basically they had started this operation without his awareness, and now they're kind of making him aware of it.
That's the question.
Okay,
right. The open question is, when did he really know that because they had the meetings on setting up something called the plumbers, right? Mm-hmm. Then they were like, we're going to plug leaks. We'll call them plumbers, So the leaks were coming from the White House. By the way, the leaks were mostly from Henry Kissinger, who Nixon loved. Always had a hobby. He always had somebody he was in love with, and he liked the intellect and the heft of it, and the big strategy thinking, and realpolitik of Kissinger, who was from Harvard. And
history likes to claim too that Kissinger liked Ford better. But anyway.
I'm sure. That's the way Kissinger was. So they have, these leaks are coming out, and especially after the Pentagon Papers dropped, and it had nothing to do with his administration. This was documents from the Johnson administration on Vietnam that had come out, and Nixon. That's where they started the plumbers, and there was all these leaks going in the New York Times, so they start the plumbers. Well, anyway, the movie is during the election of 72, Nixon's going to crush McGovern. There's no chance in hell. He would go on to do a 48 state landslide, and they didn't even need to do this stuff, but they're overshooting their hand, and they're going to get intel on the Democrats. And so you have G. Gordon Liddy, and in the movie, and even some of the stuff I've read, they're telling him about this, and he's about to leave, and they said, "Oh, there's one more thing. There's this guy Hunt," and he goes, "Howard Hunt," and Nixon turns around and says, "Howard Hunt? Howard Hunt's working in the White House?" And he says, "This is goddamn Disneyland." This is what he says. He goes, "Well, since when?" And he's like, "So since you brought somebody else in, they wanted this covered." And he just sits down in his chair and just starts thinking. And he goes, "Oh, he's on the list of horribles. I know who he is, and I know who he tracks back to."
Mm.
So what he's referring to is something called Track 2. And Track 2 was an operation to overthrow governments or communist-leaning leaders, coup d'etats, stuff that the CIA was running in the 50s. And it had really took on a life of its own going into the 1960s, and it's something that Kennedy inherited. See, like it would have been Nixon, right? There's Nixon, Kennedy, 1960. Nixon would have just basically, there would have been a continuity of things. So it would have been Nixon in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and maybe there wouldn't have been one. Or maybe there have been Armageddon, just kind of one or two things. I'm a huge Kennedy fan too for his stance on peace. And I think Nixon had a lot of respect for John Kennedy, but they were two very different men. Mm-hmm. Very different in their world outlook. And it's funny because Nixon on his tombstone wanted and he has it says peacemaker. Like he always wanted to be known as a peacemaker, but he's known as a warmonger, or the incursion into Cambodia, the massive bombing. They dropped more tonnage on North Vietnam than all the bombs dropped in World War II conventionally. Some massive amount of human loss and firepower that was expended in the last years of his presidency. But that's what he wanted, was to be known as a peacemaker. But if you really go back and you look, there was this association that he had with intelligence, and you have the head of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time was Richard Helms. And the story is basically Nixon gets into the White House, and I don't know if you know this, but on November 22nd, 1963, Richard Nixon was in Dallas. He just happened to be there, and I don't know if this was arranged this way, so he would have some sort of periphery involvement, like at least association with the assassination. But he was closing a deal for Studebaker on behalf of his law firm because he was out of power. He had no power whatsoever. He'd been vice president, and then he runs for governor in 1962 and loses. He loses to who's he lose to? I have to remember when we get going, it'll come back to me. But he loses in California, and it really is. I mean, it's a time where he's just in the wilderness. And anyway, he's in Dallas.
And H.W. likes to claim he wasn't. H.W. Bush likes to claim he wasn't there either.
Or he can't remember where he was.
He has that
right?
very fun. He has a very fun ways of describing it every time he's asked.
Yeah, he always had a way of throwing people off. So Nixon understands something bad happened. Like he knows instinctually, I think, that something is afoot. We were talking about Roger Stone, who has a Nixon tattoo on his back, because he worked for Nixon, did some things, and admires Nixon. He wrote a book called "The Man Who Killed Kennedy," talking about Roger Stone, and
we did an episode with him on that book. At this point, it's still our highest viewed episode. I think we almost hit 500,000 views on it.
Okay. Oh, good. Well, there's something in that book, and I read it, years ago. But one of the things that Nixon, they said they saw after Ruby goes in and kills Oswald to shut him up, right? Nixon's watching the feed, and he sees Ruby, and they said his face, he just goes pale because he sees Ruby, and he remembers that Ruby was a contact of LBJ while Nixon was running on the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was going to use him as a witness.
Mm.
So Nixon knows who Ruby is, and he associates it with LBJ. So I think he's starting to put a lot of things together, because he knows how everything, the sausage is made. I mean, this is some dirty business. And then you're talking about the military-industrial complex and the CIA and all the intelligence groups. And if you watch the movie Nixon, I mean, Stone takes artistic license, but they put Larry Hagman on, who was JR on Dallas, and this is, back in the 94, I think 94 is when it came out, 95. And he's playing this character called Jack. And Jack brings him out to the ranch outside of Dallas on the same day and says, we're going to give you a shit pot full of money to run in 1964. And Nixon says, nobody's going to beat Kennedy with all the money in the world. And they said, what if he doesn't run? And he said, well, that's impossible. And there's a guy in the corner that just looks at him, what if he doesn't run? So there's this association that there was something else going on. Nixon kind of knows about it.
So is that why he's alarmed when he hears like the name Howard Hunt? Is that why he's alarmed then?
Right.
Because he's a CIA guy?
Yes, he knows who he is. He knows that what Howard Hunt tracks back to, right? And tracks back to intelligence. And
well, that's kind of interesting then, because you're talking about these revolutions throughout South America and things like that. And it would kind of be like, well, wait, why is he working in my White House? Is he doing something to me? Like, is that the thought process? So I think at the end of the day, there was a lot of this. What happens to Nixon is he fulfills his dream, becomes commander in chief, and then the defects of his character is paranoia. And he starts to want to undo the past. He once he hears about this with Hunt, he tells Bob Haldeman to go to the CIA and shut it down. And then Bob Haldeman's like, he's like, he said, they're going to open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing again. And they just don't understand what this means. They're like, what do you mean? Like, that's Kennedy's screw up. Why does that mess with us? And he says, just do what I say. And so I think what he's thinking is that there's going to be some kind that they're screwing with him. So he wants to get all his documents of everything he signed as vice president while he was working with Eisenhower on these intelligence operations. And the thing just snowballs from there. Like once he goes in, then he actually goes, my goodness, if you go watch the movie, there's this just haunting, the visit that he goes over to Langley and goes to the CIA and just shows up and wants to get his files. And I mean, I recommend anybody watch the movie. Stone takes some license here, and I don't want to go into it's not about the movie. I read books on this. It's not about the movie, but they're just, it really captures, I think, the time that we were in and the Cold War, what Nixon had. He wanted to, first of all, open China, which that was not CIA policy. And it's actually this exchange that they have. And he says, Richard Helms says, that's not CIA policy. And Nixon says, you have no policy but what I give you. And like there's this, and they get really, there's facing off and, who's really in charge. And I think that the opening of China, the push for the Strategic Arms Limitations Agreement, the SALT Treaty with Brezhnev, this was something that was revolutionary because it was like this continuation of Cold War was supposed to go on forever. And we had our side, they had their side. But Nixon sees this thing with Kissinger too, where they're going to open up China, basically bring it into our sphere, not have monolithic communism, isolate the Soviet Union, and there's what they call triangular diplomacy. Well, these are big ideas that were just, these were his, and Kissinger's carrying him out, and Nixon does that. He goes in 72, real huge gamble because he does it, on the election eve to open China. And again, this is the time of Watergate. It was, I believe, June of 1972. The G. Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, these guys break in with some Cubans. There's always a Cuban. There's always Cubans involved in this whole thing, and the Cuban thing coming back to the Cuban Missile Crisis to
what we understand, Operation Mongoose and everything that happened, the JFK assassination. And if you're really paying attention, there's something there with the Bay of Pigs and Kennedy firing Allen Dulles and everything in the aftermath of that. So Watergate, in my opinion, because if you look at it, it's an anomaly. It's the only time that really journalism is just let loose, right? You have Woodward and Bernstein.
It's not even let loose. It's also a little bit weird, right? Like Bob Woodward doesn't have a journalism background. He's brand new and he's got like the biggest story of his life. It's kind of strange, like how you get this group together of Woodward and Bernstein.
It really is strange. And they have this contact, which I think the contact was built for them, which was I think it was Mark
Felt. It was the deputy FBI director, and like supposedly he didn't like Richard Helm, so he was kind of doing this in hopes that Richard Helm would get removed and he would get Helm's job. Was right. At least what I've read.
And there, of course, Pat Gray was head of the FBI, but Nixon calls, Nixon's talking to the head of the FBI. He sends Haldeman over to talk to him. He sends Haldeman over to talk to Dick Helms, which is kind of odd, because they have the domestic intelligence program and that Nixon wants implemented. Nixon keeps telling people, he's like, there's somebody's funding these kids, like the revolution of the 1960s, the counterculture. He's like, it's the communists. Why don't you guys see this? And it sounds like me because I'm like, somebody's got to fund these people. That's what I'm always looking at. And he's follow the money. Well, where Nixon gets in trouble is he wants Howard Hunt to shut up. And I believe Hunt's wife, she dies in a plane crash. And they find like cash and all these contacts and like all her belongings. And Hunt just kind of goes off the deep end at that point and starts saying, I want money. So Nixon says, pay him. So that's where you get into like the obstruction of justice and other things. And Nixon wants him just to go away. It's kind of an after the fact botched burglary. They were looking for a letter and donation by Howard Hughes. That was an illegal donation. Of course, Howard Hughes had also funded Donald Nixon, Nixon's brother, and Nixon didn't know about it, like bailed him out of a bad business deal with a convenience store or something, gave him like $250,000 at the time, did something to bail him out. And there was an association there supposedly with Howard Hughes. So they were just looking for something that they didn't even need. They were crushing the election. George McGovern was never going to be president. The Democrats were in disarray. Nixon was law and order. The country was, under basically it was this revolution of the 1960s and the counterculture. So it was a lock. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like they just botched it, and in the aftermath, it's just trying to cover up what he called a third-rate burglary. But like you mentioned, here comes Mark Felt, and here comes Woodward and Bernstein, and all of a sudden the country's enthralled with, what did he know and when did he know it? And then you have the 18 and a half minute gap. And that's the question that
keeps getting repeated in the press is what did the president know and when did he know it? So I think it's a really vital point.
And so Nixon keeps going through these machinations trying to show that he didn't know about it. But the problem is he's trying to also cover his tracks, I believe, in he keeps using the phraseology, and even you can look, the Bay of Pigs. You can listen to some of the actual audio recordings. It's going to open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing again. So this is an intelligence thing. This has really nothing to do with the politics of it. If you notice, it didn't sway any vote. It wouldn't have done anything. It was just him. He had this rogue intelligence operation inside the White House to plug leaks, and it just blows up in his face. So there's something with that as well. And again, it just continues.
Like, do you think that action was something to set him up, to put him in a position like this? Like maybe the agency's thinking he's kind of outlived his good or something, or what do you think about that? That's
a great question. I think with the moves he made, opening China, the moves he was making with détente, which was he wanted to be a peacemaker. These are the same lines of fate that JFK followed, just in a different way. JFK came right out in the open American University speech, June of 1963. I recommend anybody go and listen to that. If you're, gosh, in the times we live in where the politicians are so dumb and can't talk, and there's no oratory anymore, there's no bold ideas, there's no, again, I'm a connoisseur of language, and I hear, JFK's American University speech, and it's beautiful. You can listen to it anytime. It's inspiring. It's deep. You don't hear that anymore. Turn on the debate. Goodness, your brain's just melting from the ignorance. So you don't hear that anymore. I think that Nixon crossed that line in some way, but in a different kind of way. And there's these big geopolitical moves. He becomes an enemy. And again, there's always a price to pay. So also you have the line of succession. They get rid of his vice president is Spiro Agnew. Mm-hmm. Spiro Agnew is this, virulent anti-communist guy, kind of plays the role of kind of like what Nixon did for Eisenhower. He's kind of the bulldog. He goes out on the trail and, he'll say the hard things. What did he have about the nattering nabobs of negativism? Like he just goes and just goes after the press and, has Pat Buchanan writing things for him. It's very right-wing stuff. Well, they get Spiro Agnew. First they get Agnew. They get him on income tax evasion because he took donations in cash illegally or something while he was governor of Maryland. And so they get rid of him. So there's this line of succession, right, where you're going to get Rockefeller, right? So you're going to get Ford and then Rockefeller. So, and just not, forget that Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
So you can support the Wellness Company by heading over to twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. Get up to 15% off select products. Support the Wellness Company and help support this show. Thanks again.
He's a strange character to me historically. He was one of the guys that you and I were talking about before we started recording because he's got an interesting background. Because we're producing a future episode on Ford, by the way, for people listening. But he's got a weird background. So he's not born Gerald Ford, by the way. He's born Leslie Kane Jr. And then he takes the name of the guy that later adopts him when his mother remarries, which is kind of weird. He's on the Warren Commission, which is strange, and he's actually assigned to writing the biography of Oswald. Is like part of like what his actual task is on the commission. So that in itself is also strange. Like he's the guy basically deciding who this assassin is. So then you look at him in terms of like how he gets into the White House. He's the only unelected president we've ever had in American history because he's Spiro Agnew's replacement, but he's
He's never on a ticket
in the second term, so he's never actually voted for. And then when Nixon's gone, he has a clear path to then being president. And also, I find as well, I don't know if you've considered this too, his after presidency, I also find a little bit weird because after presidency, he's the one that creates what's called the club of ex-presidents. How they're all hanging out together and having cigars and drinking beers, and he's like, tries to be best friends with Jimmy Carter. And to me, it's kind of weird because he's almost like saying like, it's almost like publicly promoting a deep state. It's kind of weird.
Right. It's hinting at, didn't they do like a national treasure where there's like a club of presidents or something? Only presidents have like this secret society. You have to be a president to have made it or something. It's like whatever the sequel was to the national treasure with Nick Cage. No, you're right. And I may be getting my history wrong and doing this is off the cuff, but I'm pretty sure like when Reagan challenged Ford in 76, Ford pretty much should have been a shoo-in, except for he pardoned Nixon when Nixon leaves office. He should have been a shoo-in. Reagan steps up, challenges him in the primary. Ford eventually gets nominated, but it's a fight, and that's supposedly why he lost to Jimmy Carter. And one of the stories, and I could be getting this wrong, and write me if I did, and I'll look it up later. But I want to say that one of Ford's advisors, after Reagan was done with everything and the convention went on, I think they mailed him 30 silver dimes because he was Judas. They gave him 30 pieces of silver.
30 pieces of silver.
Yeah, that's the way they saw it. Like his challenge to Ford was so unnecessary or whatever. They thought this, like, Reagan's bringing the conservative movement. But Nixon, he just really is unlike any other figure that we've had in the American presidency. It's a complicated thing. He loved Woodrow Wilson. Like, that's the desk he had when he was in the White House. Which I find
strange because I don't know about you. I hate Woodrow Wilson. I think
Awful.
He's likely our worst president in history.
Awful. And again, that's the weird dichotomy that, but Nixon also, like, he saw the talent of somebody like Patrick J. Buchanan as like a young editorial writer, right-wing guy, follower of William F. Buckley. And Nixon just brings him in, like, tell me what you're thinking. Like, Buchanan would tell these stories about Nixon that, like, he would, after the presidency, they called him the Sage of Saddle River because it was in Saddle River in New Jersey, I believe.
That's where I live.
Right. And they would meet sometimes in Washington, like they meet at a hotel and they go in and Nixon would know, like, tell me everything that's going on. Like, who's up, who's down, what's the inside scoop. And he said when you leave the meetings with Nixon, he'd ask you so much, he'd pull all the information out of you. And you just leave there just so tired because he wanted to know. So, this is a very deep thinker, a very disciplined man. And the fact that he lost control of the presidency and lost control of his people, it really, what lessons can be learned? It's ego. The ego killed his presidency, I believe. Like, he could have stepped up at any time and just said, I made these mistakes. But that was not in his character. Like, he had to fight. He had to put up a defense. Never felt like he was welcomed and he never accepted. Even with the presidency, there was something in him that never could quite accept that he had made it. And, even though he would always go for the big things like the opening of China, which is, people don't realize how huge that was. And he was right because no Democrat could have ever done it. They'd been called, communist sympathizer, but Nixon, the guy who brings down Alger Hiss, anti-communist, vice president for Eisenhower, then Nixon can do it. And so there was a lot of moves, I believe, on the geopolitical field. His ending of the war in Vietnam, he goes to an all-volunteer military, he takes the troops, starts pulling them out of Vietnam. I know it's like you associate Nixon with Vietnam and escalation, but he's like escalating as he's pulling out. He called it peace with honor. And he never could figure out, like, well, I ended the war. What more do you want? But no one would give him credit because he'd do things like before the actual end of the war, the ceasefire, he's going into Cambodia. He's trying to hit these VC bases that he felt that were not being targeted because of the national sovereignty or whatever, borders and stuff. He goes into it. There's just so much here. And, again, Watergate, it's after the Watergate hotel, this break-in, and, they didn't get anything, no success, no one was harmed, but they captured these guys, and then there's these Cubans and these intelligence people, and they left their IDs in the hotel safe. It's just this botched thing that's so bizarre, and it ends up, he's trying to cover it up. And you really look at it, you have to just ask the question, why was he covering this thing up? And I believe that it has to do with the ties of intelligence, people like Howard Hunt, who, Howard Hunt is this really weird figure in history. Supposedly he was one of the hobos, like they have these pictures of these hobo guys that were also detained in the aftermath there in Dealey Plaza. And he could have been, one of the extra shooters or told to be there as an observer or something. Unknown. But I think Nixon had this deep paranoia about the intelligence and the national security state that he knew he wasn't quite in control. There's another story, and you find in the movie that's actually happened. One night, they have this massive protests, and there tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. There's a lot of people that had descended on Washington, and they were all camped out at like the Lincoln Memorial. And Nixon just takes his driver, or takes his aide, Manolo, another Cuban that works for him, and he just goes out there. He just wants to talk to these kids. And that the Secret Service doesn't know about it. So he just leaves the White House and goes out, and they're like, what? And when they find out, they're just freaking out. Like, he left the White House, So he goes and he tries to talk to the kids and tell them about Lincoln. Like, he brought the country together, and I'm trying to do the same thing. And there's this interaction he has with this young woman in the movie. And there's a lot of lore about when this happened and what actually was discussed. But he starts talking to her about, I'm trying to do the best. I'm pulling the troops out. I've cut the military budget for the first time. And so I'm trying to do this and that. I'm trying to bring peace. And she just says, you can't control it, can you? You're powerless. And then he just says, no, I'm not, and she said, I think I can control it, maybe even make it do a little good. And she's like, it sounds like you're talking about a wild animal. And he goes, well, maybe I am. And so I think there's this weird thing where he really wants to connect with people. He really wanted to bring peace, but he's a very conflicted man because he knows the realities of geopolitical strength. And
well, he'd also been playing the game too. Like, if you look at earlier in his career, like, he's, as you said, it sounds like he was involved in a lot of these overthrows. So I don't know. I feel like at a certain point, if you feed the beast, you let the beast get so big. At a certain point, you can't tell the kitty that's become a lion to be a kitty again. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, he just talks about those Wall Street bastards and the military guys and the national security state. He's just saying it's a beast. And he's doing his best to control it. So the paranoia just continues to ramp up. And he abandons a lot of the practices that he had in the 1960s that kind of reset his nervous system. And, he would read deeply, and he was on medication. He had I'm pulling a lot of memory out. He had a doctor named Hutzinger that I tried to get one of the books that Hutzinger wrote, but it was like his friend, and that is this psychologist that would recommend like low grade, like barbiturates, like Valium and other things, or a derivative of that was like, hey, don't drink so much to calm down. Like, take one of these, you'll be a lot better off. Because Nixon would just get so wound up. And when he becomes president, he isolates. He puts a fire in the fireplace even when it's hot outside, and runs the AC on high. He buries himself in the Lincoln's sitting room, with this fire going all the time, listening to these old World War II, the renditions of the Battle in the Pacific and all this stuff from different orchestras. And he'd watch the movie Patton over and over again. So he's losing himself drinking Johnny Walker. And
I think a lot of us can lose ourselves being Johnny Walkers. You got to be kind of careful with that stuff.
Oh, God help us. I know. I've had the same thing. And my affection for who he was as a historical figure, you just see it's kind of man against the world, isolation, big thinker, misunderstood, has all these enemies, and they continue to multiply. So this really happens. I think there is an operation, because we know now with 50 years past that these things don't spring up. We haven't had another type of Watergate. I mean, you can't compare Kenneth Starr, what happened with Kenneth Starr and Bill Clinton to anything that happened to Richard Nixon. Yeah, Clinton was technically impeached or whatever. So was Trump. But none of these things are really, nobody's resigned the presidency. And Nixon is just put through this gauntlet of just being torn down piece by piece by piece. He loses all of his support. He says he's going to keep fighting, and he finally just runs. I think he just completely runs out of gas, and he knows the score. And so on August 8th, 8/8 of 1974, he resigns, and effectively on August 9th, 1974, which we just passed the 50-year mark on, and that's where you get, again, that's one of the greatest speeches in presidential history. where he comes out and just off the cuff, stream of consciousness talks about a life and character. And, some of the lines are, those who hate you don't win unless you hate them back. And then you destroy yourself. I mean, he just had these great insights. And there's a Penn from Penn and Teller even did a little thing like, hey, can you imagine being this guy? And he showed Nixon, there was outtakes of him, that famous, August 8th or so, when he comes out and addresses the nation and says, effectively, I'll resign the presidency tomorrow at noon. And before that, he's like joking with the camera guys and stuff. I mean, he's like, this is a guy who's losing everything. And he's just like laughing at people with people. And he's like, okay, and 5, 4, and he just turns it on. And so that kind of poise, like he accepted his fate. And you just got to wonder, like, how did a guy like that get to a point where this break-in that was not of his, under his orders, what is it about this break-in that leads to the loss of being commander-in-chief, again, during the height of the Cold War? It's bizarre. But then you have to think about the implications of what happened post-Nixon. And, again, Saigon falls. He had said, had he stayed in office, he would have bombed the North Vietnamese and make them, go back to the table again. So South Vietnam would have stayed intact. I believe that, by the way. I think he, and I don't think they would have done it. I don't think they would have gone. I don't think it would have happened that way. Eventually, probably, right? Because South Vietnam was a paper tiger. And you even go back to 1963 with the leader of South Vietnam, Diem, was killed in a CIA-backed coup. Kennedy found out, and it was devastating to him. It was right before he was murdered. He said, because he didn't sanction that. So he knew that there was a thing that had grown, which is the intelligence operation, that was outside of the scope of the presidency. Even, Kennedy said he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. Nixon knew better than to say that, but he was trying, I think, in an end run around to reset the geopolitical stage to be known as a peacemaker for all time, or at least his time. Mm-hmm. Didn't work out that way. Now we went on after the loss of his presidency, losing the he saw the rise of the re-engagement of the Cold War. You had Reagan, Reaganomics and SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, all that big ramp up in spending, trillions in debt. The Soviet Union was brought down, but I think Nixon had the long game. He kind of wanted to build inroads and economic alliances and other things. So it would have been a different world had he finished out his presidency, but we'll never know. And it was a presidency under siege. I mean, from the time he took, the inauguration in 1973 is just nothing but Watergate. So 2 years on and just Watergate, over and over. He says, I'm so worn out with this thing, so it just killed him, really. Again, we go back to what was Watergate. It's just such a great question. It's an anomaly. It hasn't happened again like this. Certainly, there is no more Woodwards and Bernsteins. There's only Woodward and Bernstein, right?
So let me ask you this then. I guess, do you think that this event, as it relates to, I'm trying to figure the right way to ask this question, like this event as it relates to how much control intelligence has over the executive branch, do you think this event was like a turning point for that? Or how do you think this fits in with, I guess, the amount of control that intelligence agencies have over things?
I think that Nixon was probably the last type of president that he was. He thought he was going to be like Dwight Eisenhower, and he wasn't. He didn't have that much power. I think it exposes that there is an imperial presidency, but only so much as you play ball as a conduit for the deep state. And I don't think that he fully grasped the repercussions of pushing back against the deep state or forging his own policy. And you have not seen that type of policy since. I mean, you could argue that Trump ran into a lot of those same issues, but he also wasn't trying to do anything as bold or I mean, you maybe look at North Korea, which you can applaud Trump for trying to end that finally, or come to something with Kim Jong-un. You know, that's something he did again, but also Trump hires John Bolton, so it doesn't make any sense that he wanted peace. But I think Nixon had really the last presidency where there's just this move to reset the global stage in a huge way. Mm-hmm. Reagan did it a different way with military buildup, but it strengthened all the institutions, I think, that really needed to be in check. If you watch, the church committee hearings in the 1970s, a lot of the aftermath of Watergate, I think was healthy for the country. There's a lot of introspection and who's really in charge. What are our politicians doing? All of that stuff. But Nixon himself was, I think, a victim of deep state machinations and crossing their policy. I think his policy did not overlap with theirs.
Well, so I guess looking at this in terms of, I guess where we go from here. What does Watergate tell us about our modern world when we look at kind of, whether you like him or not, a lot of what's been happening with Trump and things like that? Like how do you think that Watergate kind of relates to our modern world?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, the document NSC 68, it's something that we should bring back because we're 80 years on from 1947 and that document that sets in motion the national security state. I think we need a top-down reformation of what the role of the national security state is. I think we need to put checks and balances in. If you're aware of that, if the electorate is aware of that, which I think they're becoming more aware, that politics in a lot of ways is an operating system for something else. It's to appease you. It's to give you the illusion that you have power. But at the end of the day, the deep state is real. The permanent national security state is real. And if you cross them, then you're not going to be in power. So this has to be something that starts at the grassroots level for reformation. And I think we can have we can still have a strong national security, but the policies need to change. We need to look at things like Watergate and ask these kind of questions, like what was it that brought down a presidency and why? Was it just these mistakes or was it this something else? Is the policy of the intelligence community the same as a constitutional republic? I would argue that it's not. Mm-hmm. And, again, we can still have a strong military, we can still have strong intelligence, but there needs to be checks, there needs to be decentralization. I think that's the issue, and that's why JFK talked about smashing it into 1,000 pieces. We didn't always have this in our history. This is a post-World War II Cold War relic that no longer serves us, and it grows like a Leviathan. It grows and grows. So we can learn some lessons from these past experiences, especially Watergate. And I think diving into the role that intelligence played, not only in Nixon's presidency, but in LBJ and Kennedy, that's where, post Eisenhower, it's where it really starts. It's where it really, Kennedy's firing of Allen Dulles, who would later be on the Warren Commission next to Gerald Ford. It's just, it really is a story in which I think if people go back and look at, you start seeing the common thread here. And the common thread is the deep state does control policy. Mm-hmm. And it's not we the people at this point.
Absolutely. Well, Tony, I'm grateful that you gave us the time, man, today. You gave us almost a full hour on this, which is amazing. And I guess it gives us a lot to think about. And I think there's various aspects I want to take apart of this in the future. So I'm sure we'll end up doing something again on this. But for people watching or listening that want to connect with you, want to find out more about what you're doing out there, man, how can they connect with you?
Oh, sure. And thanks for having me on. I was looking forward to our talk, and I was just thinking about it earlier today. I was like, do I have an hour in me to talk about Nixon and Watergate? Yeah, I do. Thanks for that. And this is my wheelhouse. And if I would, even if you just called me, I would have done the same thing if we weren't on your show. You just wanted to talk for an hour. You're always fun. to talk to, and I appreciate you. You can find my website is arterburn.news, and making some updates there. You can find all my shows. And then I have my company is Wise Wolf Gold and Silver. We have a precious metals monthly membership program called Wolfpack. And if you're thinking you can't afford precious metals, go check it out, because it's $50 a month to start. It goes all the way up to $5,000. We have almost 1,300 people all over the U.S. That's my wheelhouse, is gold and silver. Of course, Richard Nixon takes us off the gold standard in August 15th, 1971. And you have to thank Gerald Ford for being as weird as he is and strange. He made gold legal for you to own. So thank you, Gerald Ford, for giving us our money back, so we can all have a real actual money as gold and silver. So that's something that we do and helps pay the bills. But again, thanks for having me on. Let's do this again soon.
So for those of you out there listening, don't forget to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. We'll catch you guys next time.